There is a border inside one country that most visitors never notice until they're standing at it. Not a line on land, but 600 kilometers of open ocean, with an immigration counter waiting on the other side. You can hold a Malaysian passport, fly on a domestic ticket, land in a city that uses the same currency, the same flag, the same national anthem, and still be told to queue up and get stamped in, like you've just entered a different country. You haven't left Malaysia, but you also haven't really arrived in the same place you started. This is the strange geography of Malaysia, a nation cut into two pieces by the South China Sea, one on a peninsula jutting off mainland Southeast Asia, the other perched on the edge of the third largest island on Earth. And the question worth asking isn't just how that happened. It's why, more than 60 years after the two halves agreed to become one country, they still feel like they're finishing a conversation that started in 1963 and never quite ended. Look at a map and the shape doesn't make sense at first. Most countries are one solid block of land. Malaysia looks like two separate nations that got assigned the same flag by mistake. On one side is Peninsular Malaysia, the long, narrow finger of land hanging off Thailand, pointing south toward Singapore. This is the Malaysia most people picture: Kuala Lumpur's skyline, the Petronas Towers catching the evening light, night markets thick with the smell of grilled satay and frying noodles. Peninsular Malaysia is where most of the country's people live, where its politics are decided, where its money moves. Then there's the other Malaysia, separated from the first by roughly 400 miles, about 640 kilometers, of the South China Sea. This is East Malaysia, made up of the states of Sabah and Sarawak, occupying the northern third of the island of Borneo, a landmass so large it's shared between three countries: Malaysia, Indonesia, and the tiny, wealthy Sultanate of Brunei tucked in between. Fly from Kuala Lumpur to Kuching, the capital of Sarawak, and you're looking at just under 2 hours in the air. Fly to Kota Kinabalu, Sabah's capital, and it's closer to 2.5. There's no bridge. There's no tunnel. Ferry routes that once connected the two halves for long-distance travel are no longer practical. So for the vast majority of the millions of trips that happen inside this one country every year, the only real option is a plane ticket. Somewhere down below, on the water, container ships pass between the two halves of a country that technically never left home. To understand why Malaysia looks like this, you have to go back to a moment that most outsiders have never heard of, even though it shaped an entire nation. For most of the 20th century, the Malay Peninsula and the northern coast of Borneo were governed as completely separate British territories. They had different administrations, different economies, different relationships with the colonial power that ran them. The people of Sabah and Sarawak weren't looking across the sea at the peninsula and thinking of themselves as the same nation. They were their own places, with their own histories stretching back long before any European ever anchored a ship offshore. Then, in the early 1960s, British decolonization sped up across Southeast Asia, and a proposal emerged to merge several of these territories into one federation: the Federation of Malaya, Singapore, and the two Borneo territories, North Borneo and Sarawak. A commission was sent to gauge public opinion in North Borneo and Sarawak about the merger, and while the response was mixed, the process moved forward, provided that certain protections were built in for the Borneo states to safeguard their autonomy within the new country. On the 16th of September, 1963, the Federation of Malaysia was formed, bringing together Malaya, Singapore, and the two Borneo territories under one flag. Singapore would leave the Federation 2 years later to become fully independent. But Sabah and Sarawak stayed, and the date of their joining is still commemorated every year as Malaysia Day, a separate holiday from the country's Independence Day, which only really belongs to the peninsula's own history. Here's the part that surprises most people, including a lot of Malaysians who've never dug into it. The agreement that brought Sabah and Sarawak into the Federation wasn't meant to make them ordinary states like the ones on the peninsula. It was meant to guarantee them special protections over things like education, development spending, and revenue sharing from their own natural resources. On paper, they were supposed to be equal partners in a three-way union, not junior members absorbed into someone else's country. Over the decades since, many people in Sabah and Sarawak feel that promise was never fully honored, that centralization by the federal government gradually eroded the autonomy they were guaranteed. That grievance hasn't gone away. It shows up in local politics, in state elections, in ongoing negotiations with the federal government in Kuala Lumpur over how much control Borneo gets over its own land, its own resources, and its own affairs. So when you land at that immigration counter in Kota Kinabalu after flying in from KL, the one that stamps you in even though you never left the country, you're not just going through a bureaucratic formality. You're touching the edge of a deal that's still being renegotiated 60-plus years later. That immigration checkpoint is worth slowing down on, because it's one of the strangest details in Malaysia's entire geography, and almost nobody outside the country knows it exists. Sabah and Sarawak have immigration autonomy. Travelers go through immigration control even when arriving from Peninsular Malaysia. It doesn't matter if you're a foreign tourist or a Malaysian citizen born and raised in Kuala Lumpur. Even Malaysians from the Peninsula need to go through Sabah or Sarawak immigration, and most citizens carry their national ID card for this internal travel rather than a passport. Foreign visitors get a fresh entry stamp, decided by the officers standing in front of them, not by whatever was written in Kuala Lumpur. The official reasoning traces back to that same 1963 agreement. The states retained their own immigration controls partly to prevent being overwhelmed by migration from the much more densely populated peninsula. For foreign travelers, the practical effect is usually painless. Most Western passport holders, including Americans, Britons, Australians, Canadians, and New Zealanders, simply walk through visa-free for up to 90 days, the same as they would on the peninsula. But the queue itself, the second stamp, the second set of questions, that's the moment travelers usually first feel that this really is a country with two different governments quietly operating underneath one national one. It's a small, bureaucratic detail, but it says something bigger. A country doesn't build a second immigration system inside itself unless the two halves genuinely see themselves as distinct. For most travelers, the story of Malaysia starts and ends on the peninsula, and it's easy to understand why. Kuala Lumpur moves at the pace of a global city that knows exactly what it is. Air-conditioned metro lines cut beneath streets where hawker stalls sell char kway teow next to glass office towers. The Petronas Towers still dominate the skyline, twin spires of steel that were, for a few years, the tallest buildings on the planet. A short drive out, and you're in Petaling Jaya or Bangsar, neighborhoods full of specialty coffee shops and co-working spaces that wouldn't look out of place in Melbourne or Toronto. Further north, Penang offers colonial shophouses, some of the best street food in Southeast Asia, and a slower, saltier version of city life by the sea. This is the Malaysia that shows up on Instagram. Affordable, developed, easy to navigate, English widely spoken, infrastructure that mostly works. Consider the ordinary rhythm of a day in KL. Morning starts with kopi and toast at a corner coffee shop, where the same uncle has been running the till for 20 years. By mid-morning, the metro carries office workers past construction cranes still building new towers on the skyline. Lunch might mean nasi lemak wrapped in banana leaf from a stall that's been there since before the towers existed, eaten standing up, gone in 10 minutes. Evenings shift toward rooftop bars overlooking the Petronas Towers lit gold against the dark, or a plastic stool table at a Mamak restaurant that stays open past midnight, serving roti canai and teh tarik to anyone still awake. But it's also only half the country, and the other half doesn't look, feel, or move anything like this. Cross that stretch of sea, and the landscape changes before the plane has even finished descending. Instead of a dense grid of highways and towers, you see green, an unbroken carpet of rainforest running to the horizon, rivers curling brown through the canopy. Sabah and Sarawak together take up close to 60% of Malaysia's total land area. Yet the two states hold a much smaller share of the national population than their size would suggest, and much of that population lives outside the main cities rather than concentrated in them. Kuching, Sarawak's capital, sits along a slow, wide river, its waterfront a mix of colonial-era buildings and modern cafes. It has the feel of a regional city that's confident in itself rather than trying to compete with anywhere bigger. Kota Kinabalu, Sabah's capital, faces the South China Sea with a coastline of night markets and a skyline that suddenly gives way to jungle-covered hills. Behind it rises Mount Kinabalu itself, Malaysia's highest point, standing over 4,000 meters, a mountain sacred to the local Kadazandusan people long before anyone marketed it as a hiking destination. Beyond the cities, the interior belongs to a different Malaysia entirely. Longhouse communities along Sarawak's rivers, some still home to Iban families living the way their ancestors did for generations, only now often with a satellite dish beside the roof. Dive sites off Sipadan Island regularly rank among the best in the world, visited by a fraction of the crowds that swarm more famous destinations elsewhere in Southeast Asia. This isn't a lesser version of Malaysia. It's an older one, a wilder one, and in many ways a more culturally layered one. Home to dozens of distinct indigenous groups whose identities existed long before the word Malaysia meant anything at all. Sabah's indigenous population is dominated by the Kadazan Dusun, followed by the Baijo and the Murat. Sarawak's is led by the Iban, followed by the Bidayuh and the Melanau, each with its own language, its own festivals, its own relationship to the land. Walk through a market in Kuching and you'll hear Iban alongside Malay and Mandarin. Sit in a longhouse gathering in the Sarawak interior, and the rhythms, the food, the social customs feel closer to something you might encounter in parts of the Philippines or Indonesian Kalimantan than to downtown Kuala Lumpur. That's not a coincidence. Borneo's cultures were shaped by the same island, the same river systems, the same long history of trade and migration across the wider Malay archipelago, a history that predates the modern national border running through the middle of it. Most travelers arrive expecting one country with two vacation modes: City Malaysia on the Peninsula, Jungle Malaysia in Borneo, like two settings on the same theme park ride. The reality is more layered than that, and understanding why takes you back to something deeper than tourism brochures. The peninsula's development wasn't an accident of geography. It's the product of decades of concentrated investment, infrastructure spending, and political power sitting in Kuala Lumpur. Borneo, despite being rich in natural resources like oil, gas, and timber, has historically seen a smaller share of that investment flow back into its own development. It's one of the quiet ironies of Malaysian geography. The states holding much of the country's natural wealth are often the ones with the least developed infrastructure to show for it. That gap isn't something a travel itinerary usually mentions, but it explains a lot of what you actually experience on the ground. It explains why roads outside Sarawak and Sabah's main cities can be rough or unfinished. It explains why healthcare and education access vary so much between a Kuala Lumpur suburb and a rural longhouse community 6 hours upriver. And it explains why, when you talk to people in Sabah or Sarawak about the government, you'll often find they mean Kuala Lumpur specifically, spoken about almost the way people in a smaller country might talk about a much larger neighbor. It would be easy to romanticize all of this, two halves of one nation, one urban and modern, one wild and untouched, existing in some kind of balanced harmony. That's not quite honest. The relationship between the peninsula and Borneo carries real friction. Sabah is formally entitled to a share of net revenue collected from its resources under the 1963 agreement, yet many in the state argue that share has never matched what was promised. Development spending, decision-making power, and political attention have tended to concentrate in the peninsula, leaving Sabah and Sarawak fighting, sometimes literally through their own state parties, for a bigger say in how their own resources and territory are governed. Surveys in Sarawak have found many residents identify more strongly with their state than with the country as a whole, a striking thing to hear from citizens of a nation only about 60 years old. For a traveler, none of this necessarily shows up as conflict you can see. Sabah and Sarawak are safe, welcoming, and among the friendliest places to visit in Southeast Asia. But it shows up in subtler ways. In a Sarawakian telling you proudly that their state controls its own timber licenses in a way Sabah doesn't, or a Sabahan explaining, half joking and half not, that flying to Kuala Lumpur still feels a little like going to Malaysia, even though they've lived their whole lives as Malaysian citizens. Getting between the two has also comes with real friction of its own. Flights are frequent and, booked early, genuinely affordable, often in the range of 100 to a few hundred ringgit one way. But there's no cheaper overland alternative for most routes. No train, no simple road trip connecting Kuala Lumpur to Kuching the way you might drive between two cities in a normal country. And once you're in Sabah or Sarawak, the size of the land plays against you. What looks like a short hop on a map can mean a 12-hour drive between towns, because so much of the interior is still covered in dense, roadless rainforest. None of this makes the country less remarkable. If anything, it makes it more honest. Malaysia isn't a finished, seamless nation stitched together from two territories. It's a work in progress, a federation still negotiating, decades later, what it actually means for these two very different places to belong to each other. Given all that, it's worth asking why travelers who make the extra flight to Sabah or Sarawak so often say the same thing, that it was the best part of the trip. Part of it is simple contrast. After the density and noise of Kuala Lumpur, arriving somewhere with more rainforest canopy than rooftops feels like exhaling. Part of it is the wildlife. Seeing an orangutan move through the trees in something close to its natural habitat is a different experience than seeing one in an enclosure. And Borneo is one of the last places on the planet where that's still possible. But talk to people who've spent real time there, and it's usually something quieter that keeps pulling them back. The pace of life along a longhouse river, the directness and warmth of communities that haven't been reshaped by mass tourism. Consider a hypothetical, entirely typical scenario. A traveler books 3 days in Sarawak expecting a jungle detour after their real trip to Kuala Lumpur, and ends up rearranging their entire itinerary to spend the extra week they didn't plan for. It's a story that repeats often enough among Borneo travelers to be, at this point, less an exception than a pattern. Digital nomads who make it to Borneo often describe a similar shift. They arrive assuming Kota Kinabalu or Kuching will be a slower, less connected version of Kuala Lumpur, a place to disconnect for a few days before getting back to real work. What they usually find instead is workable internet in the main cities, a noticeably lower cost of living than the peninsula's capital, and a lifestyle where the ocean, the rainforest, and a proper working setup are all within 20 minutes of each other. It isn't the polished, co-working space version of remote work that Bali or Chiang Mai built a reputation on. It's rougher around the edges, less discovered, and for a certain kind of traveler, that's exactly the appeal. For retirees, the calculation is different again. Housing and daily costs in Sabah and Sarawak tend to run lower than in Kuala Lumpur or Penang, and the slower pace, warm climate, and close-knit expat pockets in cities like Kota Kinabalu appeal to people who've already done fast-paced city living somewhere else and don't want to repeat it. What they trade for that is distance, from major hospitals, from international flight connections, from the conveniences that make the peninsula an easier long-term base for anyone managing ongoing healthcare needs. It's a genuine trade-off, not a hidden downside waiting to be discovered later. None of this fits everyone equally, and it's worth being specific about that instead of pretending Malaysia is a universal answer. Someone who wants dense city infrastructure, fast internet everywhere, an easy retirement or remote work base with familiar comforts close at hand. That person will likely spend most of their time on the peninsula, and probably should. Someone drawn to slower travel, wildlife, indigenous culture, and landscapes that still feel unresolved and wild. That person needs Borneo, and needs to accept the extra flight, the longer distances between towns, and the fact that comfort sometimes takes a back seat to experience out there. Trying to see both halves properly in a short trip is where people run into trouble. Malaysia rewards travelers who accept it as two separate journeys rather than one efficient loop. There's something quietly familiar in all of this, even for viewers who've never set foot near the South China Sea. Most countries carry an internal version of this same tension, a capital that gets the investment, the infrastructure, the political attention, and a periphery that holds the resources, the older cultures, the wilder land, and often feels like it's asking permission for a fair share of its own country's wealth. Malaysia's version is just unusually visible, because the two halves are literally separated by ocean, with a stamped passport as physical proof of the gap. It raises a question worth sitting with longer than the length of this video. How much of what feels like one country anywhere is really just proximity, and how much of it is something people actually agreed to share? Malaysia never really solved the puzzle of being two places at once. It just learned to fly between them.